At 215 miles, the River Thames is the longest river in England and the second longest in the United Kingdom. Along its course are numerous bridges, locks, churches, pubs and beautiful homes, many of which are reputedly haunted. Some people are convinced the river has a dark energy that takes the lives of those who dare to venture too far into its depths. As we meander from close to the river's source at Lechlade, Gloucestershire, down to Clifton Hampden in South Oxfordshire, we'll discover some of the ghostly tales from this iconic waterway. Lechlade is a town on the southern edge of the Cotswolds in Gloucestershire, England. In the 18th century, goods unloaded at the port of Bristol were carried overland to Lechlade, where they would be sent down the Thames to London. There are two ghostly figures that appear at Lechlade. One appears on the river's banks, the other at the Halfpenny Bridge. Built in 1792, the Halfpenny or Halfpenny Bridge and its toll house are now a Grade 2 listed building. A female figure in shimmering white has been seen and heard on the bridge late at night. She startles motorists as she glides across the road from one side of the bridge to the other before gazing out downstream. People have stopped their cars, concerned for the woman's welfare. Some say she weeps bitterly and points down into the water with a mournful sorrow. No one is sure who she is, but there are several suggestions as to who she may be. In 1910, 18-year-old Elsie Alice Malden, dressed in white, was found floating in the Thames just beneath the toll house at the Halfpenny Bridge. When her body was retrieved, it was discovered that she was not on her own. Her left wrist was tied with a handkerchief to the wrist of the sunken dead body of her boyfriend, Ernest Spencer, who worked as a horse groom at a nearby farm. Nobody is sure why the young lovers were found in the river, but it transpired that they wanted to marry, but it was deemed to be an unsuitable match. Earlier that evening, the couple had been seen in a nearby restaurant and appeared quite happy and content. Weeks earlier, Ernest Spencer had been found on several evenings in Elsie's living quarters at a nearby home where she worked as a domestic servant, and her family were furious on hearing this news. Could she have been pregnant? Had she brought shame upon her family? Is it Elsie haunting the Halfpenny Bridge, wishing that her life had taken a different, happier path? Just a few miles upstream from Lechlade is the small village and civil parish of Castle Eaton. Tragedy devastated this tiny community in January 1867 at the hands of the River Thames. 9-year-old Selina Tuckwell and her best friend Maria were playing on the banks of the Thames. The bitterly cold weather had caused ice to form on the edges of the Thames, but not in the middle. Selina and Maria stepped onto the ice to reach some icicles from within a bush. The ice gave way. Selina screamed and fell into the dark depths of the Thames. James Newman, an innkeeper, was in his field on the opposite side of the river. He heard the scream, grabbed some rope and ran as fast as possible to the nearby bridge. despite his best efforts, it was too late. Selina had sunk down beneath the ice and was now out of sight. Her body was retrieved 6 weeks later in a field in Lechlade. The Thames had burst its banks and carried her lifeless body onto the land. A mole catcher named John Strafford noticed her lying on the grass. She was buried in the churchyard at Castle Eton. Could her sad figure appear on the bridge next to where her body was discovered? Many locals believe that the apparition of a woman in white on the Halfpenny Bridge is that of Elsie Moulden, whose death with her lover in 1910 shocked this small community. Perhaps her restless soul will never be at peace. Just below the town of Lechlade is St John's Lock. This is the furthest upstream lock on the River Thames. Named after a nearby priory established in 1250, the lock was built in stone in 1790. The lock is watched by the statue of Old Father Thames, located just outside the lock house. This Grade II listed sculpture was commissioned for the Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace in 1854. It was moved to its current location in 1974. The lock is also overseen by another figure, a ghostly man wearing a Royal Navy uniform who stands or paces along the Lechlade or north side of the bank. He appears as a hazy figure who stares longingly into the water before walking towards Church Path that connects the area with St Lawrence Church, Lechlade. Sometimes he vanishes as soon as he is seen. Locals nickname him the ghostly captain of St John's Lock. No one is sure who he is, but some are convinced he is the apparition of Captain William John Cole, a much-loved resident of Lechlade, who passed away surrounded by his family in May 1856 at the age of 62. His long Navy career began in 1802 at the age of 8 as a second-class boy aboard the Buffalo store ship under Captain William Kent. He travelled to India, witnessed the first settlement of British convicts in Tasmania, and saw active conflict in the Napoleonic Wars in South America. He rescued many people at sea, including in June 1836, when he leapt into the sea to save the life of a gunner who had fallen from HMS Revenge. He also saved the lives of 2 men on the River Thames, Gilbert Wilson and John Snape, who got into trouble in a wherry and ended up in its murky depths. He married and had 4 daughters. In his later years, he became well known as a parishioner, magistrate and figure of trust in Lechlade. He did much to improve schools, allotments and the churchyard at St Lawrence Church, where he is buried with his wife. Could he be returning to a place he loved so much in his life to see the picturesque sights of the River Thames again? Some residents of Lechlade believe the ghostly apparition at St John's Lock is Lieutenant Commander John George Plunkett Brownrigg, a well-known local man, usually nicknamed Jack. He was the son of Robert Brownrigg, the vicar of St Lawrence Church, from 1902 until 1932. Jack was born in 1903 and was brought up with his 3 brothers at the old vicarage, just a few doors along from St Lawrence Church, Lechlade. In 1934 he married Rona, and together they had one son named Terence. After the First World War, he joined the Royal Navy, where he served on a number of vessels, including HMS Walker, Westminster and Forester, and from 1936 to 1938 his Navy career took him to Australia. In September 1938, he was assigned to the battle cruiser HMS Hood. On the 24th of May 1941, during the Battle of the Denmark Strait, Hood was struck by several German shells, which caused the aft magazine to explode. The ship sank quickly, with the loss of all but 3 of her crew. Sadly, Jack was killed in action. He was 37 at the time of his death, and his body was never recovered. Some believe he returns to his beloved St. Lawrence's Church to be with his family, who are laid to rest there in its beautiful churchyard. Could this be why the ghostly captain of St. John's Lock is seen on the footpath that leads directly to the church itself? Is the apparition that of Captain Cole, John Brownrigg, or a different person altogether? Not far from Lechlade stands Kelmscott Manor, a Cotswold limestone manor house in West Oxfordshire dating back to around 1570. This Grade 1 listed building was built by local farmer Thomas Turner, but is famous for being the country home of writer, designer and socialist William Morris. Morris leased the property from 1871 with famous painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Its attic, it seems, is home to a resident ghost. For William Morris, the manor was far more than just a rural retreat on the banks of the River Thames. He fell in love with the property, describing it to his friend Charlie after his first visit as a heaven on earth. This manor house, full of exquisite furniture, tapestries, paintings and designs, inspired the creativity of a man regarded as the founder of conservation and of the arts and crafts movement. Morris adored the authenticity of the manor's architecture, its sublime gardens, and proximity to the River Thames. William Morris died in 1896, and the manor continued to be occupied by his widow, Jane, who purchased the property in 1913. Jane features in a number of Rossetti's paintings, some adorning the walls at Kelmscott. In the painting Water Willow, Kelmscott Manor is featured in the background. After Jane's death, the manor passed to their daughter, May, who was determined to guard its legacy and preserve the manor just as her father had left it. Many textiles, furnishings and wallpapers inspired by the rural scenes at Kelmscott are still sold today and feature throughout the property, along with numerous artefacts from Morris's collection. Local villagers and volunteers at the manor have whispered for decades that the attic is the location of paranormal activity that started in the 20th century. From 1917 until her death in 1938, May Morris's companion at Kelmscott was Mary Lobb, a Land Army volunteer in the local village. Miss Lobb moved into the home and worked as a gardener. She was known for wearing a Norfolk jacket and knickerbockers. When May died in 1938, she left £12,000 and the tenure of Kelmscott Manor to Lobb. Lobb was distraught. She began to drink brandy and died from heart disease just 5 months after her beloved May. It is the ghost of Mary Lobb that reputedly haunts the attic. White ectoplasm has apparently been witnessed, and visitors and staff have heard weeping, footsteps, and tapping in the attic rooms. A female voice is heard calling out in distress. Could this be Miss Lobb searching for May? The apparition can sometimes be dormant for a number of years, but reappears to haunt the ancient attics, beams and rafters of this beautiful Cotswold manor. May is buried along with her sister Jenny, her father William and her mother Jane in the nearby St George's Church. The gravestone was designed by William Morris's friend Philip Webb and is reminiscent of a Viking-era hog-back tomb, in keeping with Morris's love of Norse mythology. Miss Lobb donated the jewellery May had left her to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Miss Lobb left strict instructions in her will. She was to have no coffin, only a plain oblong box. She was cremated and her ashes were scattered in Cornwall as stipulated in her will. Whilst her last wishes were carried out, it seems Mary can't leave Kelmscott Manor. On the banks of the River Thames, about 2.5 miles from the centre of Oxford, lies Godstow. The ruins of Godstow Abbey, also known as the Godstow Nunnery, are here as well as the Trout Inn, which can be found across the bridge from the Abbey ruins. Both locations are said to be haunted. Construction of the Abbey began in 1133 and became home to an order of Benedictine nuns. Rosamond Clifford, sometimes known as Fair Rosamond or Rose of the World, was educated at the Abbey and became famous as Henry II's mistress during the 12th century. Her relationship with Henry II was rumoured to have started in 1166, when Henry's wife, Queen Eleanor, was pregnant with their last child, John. At this time, the now demolished Beaumont Palace existed just outside the North Gate of Oxford, and the Royal Hunting Lodge at Woodstock, in particular, offered a choice of locations where their illicit affair could take place. Legends and folklore about Rosamond differ wildly, but it is believed that after 10 years, her relationship with the king ended. Rosamond retired to Godstow Abbey, where she probably died in 1176 at the age of 29. Some say she died of natural causes, others believe she was poisoned by Henry's wife Eleanor. She was buried in front of the altar at the Abbey, and her tomb, partially paid for by Henry II, became a popular shrine adorned with flowers, candles and trinkets. This outraged the Bishop of Lincoln in 1191, and he ordered her remains to be removed and buried outside of the building, claiming other women, warned by her example, may abstain from illicit and adulterous affairs. She was reinterred in the cemetery near the nuns' chapter house, which was eventually destroyed under Henry VIII. A woman in black has been observed drifting through the Abbey ruins, sometimes accompanied by the smell of heather. It is easy to assume that this is the figure of Fair Rosamond, but some witnesses claim to have seen a pair of apparitions in long flowing garments enter the Abbey ruins, then slowly vanish. Another spectre, in grey, thought to be a man, is seen gliding along the periphery of the Abbey grounds wearing a hat that looks like a top hat. Apparently, he moves at speed as though he is in a car, but his movement is entirely smooth. Some say he died centuries ago, when his coach and horses overturned and fell into the River Thames. Neither his arms or legs move. Local legend suggests that if you visit the ruined abbey at sunrise on May Day, you'll hear the sounds of nuns chanting. Just across the bridge stands the Trout Inn. This Grade II listed building was largely built in the 17th century, although it is thought to be on the site of an earlier inn. This quintessentially English pub is popular with those heading along the Thames, but there seems to be an array of ghostly activity here. A woman dressed in white has been seen gliding along the bridge, but was also witnessed by a cleaner inside the pub early one morning. The apparition walked straight through the closed, locked front door and continued to walk through a wall. The witness described her as walking on her knees. This incident scared the cleaner so much, she left and refused to come back. A member of staff witnessed the same woman in white early one morning as he brought a crate of bottles to be placed in the fridge. He said she floated through the wall and up the stairs as he stared in disbelief. Again, she was described as walking on her knees. When the member of staff asked if anyone else had seen her, nobody took him seriously, except for one. An elderly man, a regular at the pub, explained that many years ago, the floor level had indeed been raised up due to damp. They used stones from the ruined abbey to build it up. Shadowy figures are often spotted traversing the oldest parts of the pub, accompanied by cold spots and the scent of heather that can be somewhat overwhelming. In September 1903, a tragic incident occurred just outside of the Trout Inn. A 16-year-old barmaid who resided at the pub, her name was Ethel West, went out with some friends in Oxford on a Wednesday evening. She left her friends around 8:30 and began her walk home to the inn, but she never made it. 2 days later, her body was pulled from the Thames just near the lower gardens. Her friends were distraught. She'd been in excellent spirits, and they couldn't understand what had happened. There was no evidence of a struggle. The towpath in this area was wide, indicating that a fall was unlikely, and after a search of the riverbank, there was no evidence of foul play. This mysterious death of a young girl at the Trout Inn is an unsolved mystery. Clifton Hampden is a village and civil parish on the north bank of the River Thames. Described by writer Jerome K. Jerome in his book 3 Men in a Boat as a wonderfully pretty village. It has a small population, but its fair share of ghosts that are active to this day. A Grade II listed building named Courtier's House is said to be haunted by the village's most famous ghost, the apparition of Sarah Fletcher. The building today is privately owned by a business, but was originally built in the 18th century as a residence for the Fletcher family, who were the first residents in this impressive building. Sarah Fletcher was born in 1769 and became the wife of a captain in the Royal Navy. Her husband spent many months at a time at sea, and Sarah spent endless days wishing and hoping for his return, waiting and whiling away the hours in her splendid home. One day he did return, but he brought with him devastating news. He'd found someone else, the daughter of a wealthy merchant who he planned to bigamously marry. In disbelief at her husband's infidelity, matters were made worse when her husband, to her horror, revealed that he planned to marry his new love in the local village church of St. Michael and All Angels. Furious at this prospect, Sarah went to the church and managed to stop the wedding. The heiress, humiliated by the incident, left the captain at the church. Captain Fletcher returned to sea, was sent to the West Indies, and was never seen again. Sarah Fletcher, overcome by her circumstances, decided to extinguish her life in her bedroom at Courtiers. She was 29, and her cause of death was declared as lunacy. She was buried at the Abbey Church of St. Peter and St. Paul in Dorchester-on-Thames. But it appears that she still visits her beloved home on a regular basis. In 1913, author Maud Fuchs visited Courtiers at a time when it was operating as a girls' school to research her book, True Ghost Stories. She asked a member of staff about the ghost, but they were unsure. At that moment, Maud looked along the corridor to see a woman dressed in a black cloak, staring back at her. She had long, wavy red hair tied with a purple ribbon, and her pale and anguished face convinced the author that this was indeed Sarah Fletcher. Maud's research included testimonies from a clergyman named Edward Craik, who had moved into Courtiers when he was a child at the age of 10. His father was a schoolmaster and had rented the property for an exceptionally low rent. It quickly became apparent that the previous tenants didn't stay for long. They would quickly pack up and leave, sometimes with no notice. When Edward was 17, he saw the ghost of Sarah Fletcher and began to fall in love with her. Over the course of several nights, he heard footsteps approach his bedroom door. The door opened and he felt a person had entered, stood for a moment next to his bed, turned and gone out. The following night the same thing happened, but this time he followed the sound of the footsteps in the corridor. He witnessed Sarah standing by the window, gazing out into the garden. He said she seemed tremendously alive. There was nothing dead about her. Her eyes were full of tears. She wore a black silk cloak, fashionable at that period, for protecting ladies' dresses from the dust from the roads. She was hatless, and her hair was twined with a purple-red ribbon. I wanted to help her, to befriend her. Then all at once, a patch of moonlight alone marked the place where she stood. 10 years later, Edward's brother became the head teacher of the school at Courtiers, and Edward had followed his calling to become a clergyman. A letter was received by Edward indicating that ghostly disturbances had become a real problem at the school, with residents being scared of a figure next to their beds, tapping, knocking, and noisy disturbances. Edward was convinced that this activity was not that of his beloved Sarah, and performed an exorcism, which seemed to calm this malevolent force. But this was short-lived. Furniture began to move, and objects would disappear. Eventually, Edward's brother moved the school from Courtiers to another location, and the building was sold again. Whether the ghost of Sarah is still seen in the building today, we don't know. Was Sarah, perhaps in a fit of rage, responsible for the disruptive activity that scared the pupils at the school? What do you think? I must admit that I love the River Thames, and I hope you enjoyed that journey along a section of the River Thames. We started at Lechlade, which is 23 or so miles from the source, and we finished at Clifton Hampden, which is about 67 miles along the Thames. Some of you may know the book Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome, but this book is one of my favourites, and it follows the journey of a boating holiday from Kingston upon Thames to Oxford, and it was published in 1889, and I love this book so much. The three main characters are all complete hypochondriacs, and they believe they need a holiday to recover. They hire a rowing boat and they head up the Thames to Oxford, and there's a brilliant old version of it on YouTube. You can actually watch it from the 1970s with Tim Curry and Michael Palin, and I'll leave a link in the description box. There are so many ghost stories connected with the River Thames, it was actually quite difficult to narrow it down just for this episode today. But I did have a really interesting email from a viewer named Chris. And Chris has asked whether I would like to do a video in the future, perhaps on Oxford or Oxfordshire, which I think I will do. And Chris mentioned that back in the 1920s, his great-grandmother worked as a domestic servant in a house in Clifton Hampden, and this house was called the Clifton Hampden Manor House, and it was built in 1846. And his great-gran, whose name was Mary, was always a believer in the paranormal, and she was completely convinced that Clifton Hampden Manor House was haunted by a young girl who would be particularly active in the kitchens of the property. And apparently Mary was on her own on one occasion, and she was preparing some food in the kitchen when all of a sudden she could smell burning. When she turned around, she saw one of the family's large wooden door wedges had been placed on the hob and was now beginning to burn in the flames. And on another occasion, Mary felt someone stood directly behind her in the kitchen. And when she looked, her apron strings had been undone and draped into the flames and were beginning to burn. So those were the two events that Chris included in his email. I'd like to try and find out a bit more about this property. It sounds very interesting. I haven't come across it in any books about ghosts, that kind of thing. But what I did find out is that it's now owned by the singer and musician Kate Bush, and it was sold to her in 2022, and she bought it for about £6.5 million. And I wonder if Kate Bush has ever experienced any paranormal activity in the house. I would imagine she'd be quite happy to have a resident ghost. I hope it doesn't involve any fires though, and I'd like to say thank you to Chris for sharing your great-grand's story, and I'll have to see if I can find out anything else about this property. I'm going to move on to some old postcards from the River Thames in a moment, but just before I do, I just wanted to mention about Kelmscott Manor. I picked up this guidebook for about £2 on eBay, and it's really good. If you are interested, you can visit the house. You can book your tickets online, but you probably need to be aware that the property has really limited opening hours. It's open from April until the end of October, and it's only open on Thursday to Saturday. And you can have a good look at the house online from the comfort of your own home, because on their website they've got a virtual tour, which is free. So if you go on the website, click on Your Visit, and it gives you a 360-degree free tour that you can have a really good look around. And I'll leave a link to that in the description below. And I've got two postcards for you today, and this first one I think is either 1966 or 1968, but the authors of these postcards I don't think could be more different in terms of their personalities. Dear Granny and Grandad, we are having a very good holiday here in Cookham, although the weather hasn't been too good. We have comfortable beds, good food, and lots of country fresh air. We have been to 1 or 2 places, and on Monday we went round Oxford. I hope you are well. Lots of love, Richard. I think this postcard is so lovely because he's clearly so engaged in this holiday and appreciating everything that he's got. And it's funny because it's before the days of the internet, Wi-Fi, mobile phones. What a lovely card he sent to his grandparents. This next postcard is rather different, and it's from a girl called Mary to her teacher, whose name is Miss Tomlin. Dear Miss Tomlin, I have made up my mind to be a good girl and give as little trouble as I can if ever you do come back to us. Whoever teaches me, I shall try to be good. I hope you will not be cross, as I have given Madge Wright your address. Your ever-loving pupil, Mary. I think it sounds to me like Madge and Mary are a right pair. They sound like a bit of a handful, I suppose. I wonder if Miss Tomlin ever did go back. I wonder whether she would be brave enough to teach these two yet again. Anyway, I hope you really enjoyed that video all about River Thames, and I'll be with you again in a few weeks' time, and I'll see you on the next video.